Hello there, Blogging Heads land. This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show, and I'm here with Matt Stoller. Forgive me, Matt. We just discussed that, who is with the Open Markets Program at the New America Foundation and the author of a interesting piece on Silicon Valley, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, about what the source of innovation is, and is it drying up or being killed off by business practices that are familiar to us from American economic history of what large firms do when they try to lock themselves in and keep the competition out and so forth. So thanks for joining us, Matt.
Hey, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, the evidence is piling up. Silicon Valley is being destroyed. That's a pretty strong statement. You want to tell us what you're talking about? That's the title of your Business Insider piece from April 19, 2017. And you expressed some very strongly worded concerns there. I wonder if you want to share with the audience what your concerns are.
Sure. I just so you know, the editors write the headlines. That was the headline. I wrote the piece. So
I do know about that problem. I'm
yeah,
familiar with
yeah.
that problem.
That headline was designed to get clicks, and I would click on that. So I think it's a good headline. Uh,
Yeah.
so I started the piece by looking at Theranos, which is that Elizabeth Holmes business, quote unquote business, where she dressed up like Steve Jobs as a 19-year-old or 20-year-old Stanford student and said, "I've invented this process to detect all sorts of bloodborne illnesses or characteristics based on just pricking your finger." And she raised a lot of money and had, at a certain point, was a billionaire based on this kind of act. And it turns out that the technology just didn't exist, that she was lying about it. And she got like Henry Kissinger and a bunch of like George Shultz and a bunch of like important people to be on her board. And it's super embarrassing, right? I think they had a deal with Walgreens or something like that. Incredibly embarrassing because it's a fraud. I don't know how she's still walking around free, but she was just making it up. And
Matt, will you let me just tell the viewers that this is the young woman who left Stanford as a freshman, if I'm not mistaken, with an idea about how a prick of the finger and a drop of blood would be, by virtue of her technology, her company's technology, sufficient to do all kinds of examinations and would allow for blood work to be done much more cheaply and much more universally than it is now done, claiming that the accuracy of the analysis of the blood from a drop from the finger would be just as good as what one might get from drawing a larger quantity of blood, which is a traditional practice now. And on the basis of this idea and claims that were being made about it, was able to raise billions of dollars in venture capital funding. And correct me if I say anything that's wrong, but I just want people to know what we're talking about. And herself became a celebrity as a woman, a young woman, who had joined the ranks of Silicon Valley billionaires, the first of her particular female and so forth category to do so. But no one has ever been able to find strong evidence of the fact that the technique that she's talking about actually works.
yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious that, I mean, the regulators keep coming down on them. Walgreens broke the deal. Like FBI has an investigation. It's a fraud, right? And but it was there was that. There was another company called Juicero, and Juicero is this very ornate, this guy that like raised a ton of money, including a lot of money from Google Ventures, to basically create a very high tech juicer. That it's like a juicing machine that you connect to the internet, and then he would sell you packets of sort of raw vegetables and fruit. And it turns out that you can just take the packets and squeeze them, and juice comes out. And like it's like ridiculous, right? I mean, this was like he wanted to disrupt juice the way that Steve Jobs disrupted the computer industry. And it's like embarrassing that these are the kind of big ideas coming out of Silicon Valley. Now, the problem isn't that dumb things are coming out of Silicon Valley. The problem is that it's been a pretty long time since some really innovative stuff came out of there. And, you're always going to have dumb stuff. You're always going to have a little bit of fraud when you have speculation and innovation, but you should also have some big breakthroughs. Why aren't the breakthroughs really happening anymore? That's the kind of question that I was putting forward. Why are we, you had pets.com in 1999 and 2000, but you also had Amazon. Why do we have Theranos and Juicero, but no, particularly innovative companies? And the answer that I think my sense is, you see other things. You see productivity dropping. You see the rates of small business formation declining. You don't see many tech IPOs anymore. The ones you do see, like Snapchat, are happening, and the stock isn't doing particularly well because of what's going on with Facebook emulating their business model and foreclosing on them. What you're seeing is effectively 3 to 5 companies, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, using their market power and their control of different parts of the industry to foreclose new entrants from coming into the business. And this is destroying the productivity of Silicon Valley in all different ways, and it's eroding the ability of this incredibly important innovation machine to actually function. Now, we have had this problem before, and the reason that we saw innovation and actually the creation of Silicon Valley is because there were antitrust suits to stop the incumbents from blocking innovation. There was an antitrust suit against AT&T, actually multiple ones, and a consent decree in 1956 which said that the company could only operate in the telephone and data industry, and it had to license all of its patents from Bell Labs on a non-discriminatory basis. And a bunch of the patents that it invented were then used and commercialized. For example, the electronic transistor was the one that I talked about. That's kind of a big one.
That's a big one.
Yeah, and Motorola both commercialized the electronic transistor a few years later, roughly throughout the same time. But you saw a similar consent decree against RCA, which was controlling radio and television components. You saw a consent decree. Not a consent decree, you saw a suit against Xerox, which invented the graphical user interface in its Park Labs, where Apple famously got those concepts. You saw IBM was under a massive antitrust suit from 1969 until 1982, and because of that, the scrutiny, the suit was dropped by the Reagan administration, but because of the scrutiny, they were on their best behavior and unbundled software from their hardware, which meant that, if you used to buy computers from IBM, they would just give you the software for free. So there was no point in being in the commercial software industry. IBM said, okay, fine, we'll stop doing that. We'll charge for our software. And then all of a sudden you could program software and sell it on IBM machines. And that was a big deal. That was the creation of the commercial software industry. You also saw IBM choosing when they were creating a personal computer to compete with Apple's personal computer. They went and said, we are going to treat our suppliers well, and they went out and they signed contracts with a small company, not that small, but smallish company called Intel, and a small company, I think it was in Albuquerque at the time, called Microsoft. And that was, that's a big deal. That creates this really competitive landscape in the computer industry, the personal computer industry. In the 80s, you saw lots of clones. You saw a whole ecosystem, Compaq, Dell, HP, all competing in that industry, and a whole bunch of others. And then in the 90s, you also saw a suit against Microsoft for trying to leverage its control of the operating system market, which it had already leveraged into control of the word processor and spreadsheet market, business productivity tools. They tried to leverage that into control of the internet through tying their browser to their operating system. And the antitrust suit against Microsoft basically prevented them from doing that. So you saw the creation of companies like Google and then eventually Facebook, and kind of Web 2.0, the whole innovation economy that emerged in the 2000s as a result of that antitrust suit.
Got it.
Now you see every time there's a king, basically, a revolutionary becomes a king, they try to stop other revolutionaries from disrupting the industry. And antitrust has been the traditional tool to actually prevent that from happening, to allow for our political liberty to innovate, to compete in these markets. And because the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the antitrust bar has kind of turned against using monopolization, traditional monopolization models to look at these businesses. What we're seeing is radical limitations on our ability as Americans to compete, and this has the consequence of reducing and destroying the amount of innovation in Silicon Valley. So the only kinds of innovation you see are innovation which is stupid, like Juicero, or fraudulent, like Theranos. And that's the basic theory behind the piece that I put out there.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple questions about this. I am a professional economist, it should be noted, though antitrust law, economics, and whatnot is not any areas of my specific specialization. But I'm generally literate about some of the literatures and the analysis that goes on in this area. One question I have, just very straightforward. So diminishing returns would suggest that once I open up an area of technological innovation, the big ideas, as it were, the low-hanging fruit, are going to manifest early on, and incremental innovation is going to become progressively harder as the technology matures. Why can't some of the, or all of the decline in the rate at which new ideas, products, and techniques are being introduced, to which you're calling attention, be accounted for by the observation that, well, the law of diminishing returns applies in extraction of resources, it applies in scale of production of ordinary products, and it applies as well in the generation of new ideas and techniques. It's just getting harder and harder within a maturing technological niche to find profitable new ideas. Relatedly, I'd ask you, so that's the diminishing returns question. Relatedly, I want to ask you about the Silicon Valley culture question, because these examples that you've called attention to, Theranos, which you allege, and I hope you've got a good libel lawyer. I understand that Elizabeth Holmes, don't play, is a fraud. How the hell did she raise billions of dollars from people? Okay, you're going to have an answer to that, but what I mean to say is, that would seem to me to have more to do with what happens at cocktail parties in San Francisco when high-flying venture capitalists are kicking around ideas with their lawyers and their potential, innovators, and certain things have cachet, Juicero. Maybe this is a reflection of telling us more about the kind of culture amongst the technological hoi polloi and things that they think are good ideas, and it's telling us about antitrust or industrial structure. And finally, so that's the culture question. Are we just saying something about Silicon Valley culture here when we see bad ideas attracting so much money, and not about blocking out by incumbent firms? And the third thing would be, well, why don't we have direct evidence? What are the sleeping patents? If indeed Google or Amazon or Microsoft or whatever are sitting on ideas and are trying to block other people from coming in, shouldn't we be able to point directly at, well, this is an idea that shouldn't we be able to point directly at specific enterprises that might have been undertaken but that we think are being blocked by the big incumbents? Well, so those are three questions.
Okay, so I'll start with the third one. Let's take Amazon. So Amazon in 2005, there was a company that started called diapers.com. I think it was called Quidsy, but their site was diapers.com. And they had a certain way of selling diapers and products for parents to handle babies. And I don't know. I'm not a parent. I don't know the specifics of what they did, but presumably parents loved it. It was very fast growing. And in 2010, Jeff Bezos said, this is a problem. This is a space that we want to own. So he started to discount. He had his programmers come up with a tracking software and just had Amazon change their prices consistent with diapers.com's prices and just consistently underprice them. And then he had his executives go to diapers.com executives and say, hey, you should sell to us, and we will price diapers at zero if necessary to destroy your business, so you need to sell to us. So diapers.com started talking to Walmart about selling, but ultimately sold to Amazon for a lower price than they probably would have been able to. And then Amazon raised the prices of diapers. It's very complicated, but they basically took a bunch of discounts away that they had offered. And the goal there was to destroy a different kind of online selling business. And
we used to call that predatory pricing when I was in graduate school. You can't price below your cost with the intent of driving a competitor out of business just because your pockets are deep and you can afford to run the losses until the competitor goes belly up. That's against the law. What happened here, as you describe it, is there was a threat to do something which, if it had been undertaken, it seems to me would have obviously been illegal.
They did it, and the courts have ruled, and this is the Chicago school, the courts ruled that predatory pricing, it's rarely undertaken and even more rarely successful. I think that was the quote from the court that said that basically made predatory pricing impossible to prosecute. I mean, what they said is not if you're engaged in predatory pricing, not only do you have to prove as a harm that the entity is lowering prices below cost, but you also have to prove that there's going to be a recoupment later on. So you have to prove that they're going to raise the price later on. Now, how do you prove that if you're under attack? They haven't driven you out of business yet. So the government, the court made it impossible because this was an ideological supposition that market power didn't matter. What mattered was efficiency and price. And they just assumed, well, if they're lowering their prices, that's good for the people who are buying the diapers. Of course, it's a misuse of power to take over a market, and that's what Amazon did. And that's one of the more high-profile cases. They've also done not predatory pricing necessarily, but some very aggressive anti-competitive tactics in the book industry, which is their oldest business. But the point is, I mean, they have lots of businesses that sell through their marketplace, and they force businesses to sell through their marketplace, and then if they think that they can, they will they will actually compete with those businesses. So if they think if you're selling something that they can produce for a lower price and they see that it's doing well, they will do that. They will start selling it, and then they will place their item above yours in the Amazon marketplace. There are all sorts of ways that Amazon does this in lots of different, they do this with their logistics and fulfillment business, but Google does it too. Google and Facebook are dominant in the ad market, and what you've seen in the last few years, I mean, the ad market is really complicated and weird, full of conflicts of interest and anti-competitive practices, but what you've seen is basically a total collapse in venture capital investment in the ad tech space. It's not that there are no good ideas in ad tech, it's just that everybody knows that Google and Facebook dominate and are capturing nearly all of the increase in revenue.
I'm sorry, Matt, what is ad tech?
Sorry, ad tech is the is the business of mediating the selling of advertising online. So it's about a $60 to $70 billion domestic business, $200 billion global business. It's essentially, it used to be Mad Men. You'd have an ad agency mediating between the ad buyers.
Okay,
and
so if I'm a company
publishers.
who is interested in advertising my product or service, I might procure the services of an ad tech firm to help me manage that process with online
Yeah,
entities.
like you want to reach, I'm selling cars, right? I want to find people of this demographic in this area who have recently visited a car site and have just done a search for,
Yeah,
you know, looking for a car or something
yeah.
like that, or best value for cars. You can, there's only like what you do is you go to a service, usually Google or maybe your ad agency will put it together for you, and spend some money, and most of that money sticks to the fingers of either Google or Facebook, who are the institutions that have the most data about the people in what they're doing online. But what you're seeing with Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple is this incredible threat to foreclose rivals from markets. And so, of course, if I come along and I say, I have this great way of selling products online, this innovation, or I know this great way to improve the advertising experience. And by the way, the current ad model is terrible. It's full of fraud. And I'm not just saying this, like the head of Procter & Gamble's ad buying unit, who's the most powerful guy in advertising and ad buying. His name's Mark Pritchard. He's been giving speeches this year talking about how the ad supply chain is full of fraud and crap. So this is it's not an efficient industry. It's just an industry that's dominated by very powerful players. What you're seeing is that nobody who wants to create a better way to do things, a better mousetrap, is going to get the financing they need. And if they somehow manage to bootstrap it, they will be foreclosed or bought out really, really quickly. And so what you see, I mean, the stats are pretty clear. It is about twice as hard to start a business today as it was in 1982.
That's across the board, not just the tech sector.
That's across the board. That's right. And this is So that, I mean, that if you're just looking at business formation, I can't name, I don't know the ideas that weren't promulgated. But if I'm a venture capitalist, right, or if I'm thinking of going into technology, or if I'm thinking of starting at this point, it's not just Silicon Valley. I mean, Amazon's selling everything. I have to keep in mind the number one threat to my ability to make it are these giants. So that's going to have a really significant impact on innovation. That is, if you believe that, I mean, look, if you've ever worked in a big company before, or government or some large institution, like, that it has a lot of resources and potentially power, but they aren't necessarily the most innovative places. They're not always the places where you can go and try something new. You have to get like 15 people to sign off on stuff.
Yeah.
And so, of course, the innovators, entrepreneurs often come out of big businesses because they learn how the industry supply chains and industries work, and then they go and they start their own business.
Yeah.
Well, that's less and less possible these days because you have these giants that are in there just squashing everyone.
Okay, what about my other two questions having to do with Silicon Valley culture and with basically just the law of diminishing returns, telling me that innovation is bound to slow, the flow of innovation is bound to slow as the maturity of a technological niche advances?
Well, I don't really have that's an interesting argument. Robert Gordon has talked about that. He's basically said there's really nothing left to invent. He's like, the best invention ever was the toilet. And I gotta say, like lifespan, I've seen different stats on this, but like the average lifespan was like 45 in the 19th century. I am a big fan of toilets. I think that there's, the electrification is it's just amazing. And, if you're an American in 1845, I think there's a good argument that you have more in common with surf than you do with an American living in the 1920s.
Sure.
You're an American in the 1920s. You have more in common with an American today than you do an American in the 1845.
Sure.
So those innovations are just like radically significant. But I don't really buy that there's nothing more to invent. I think people always kind of say that. And we have, you have like billions of people who are now connected to the internet and with phones, and there's just amazing technology now that's available, and there's mass literacy. It's just impossible, I think, to maybe we'll never have another invention as great as the toilet, but there's just so many awesome opportunities, and there's so many significant problems that people can take on that I just have a hard time buying that that's really a causal factor in anything. We also have new problems. I mean, climate change is a big problem.
Yeah.
We have new diseases. We have new social issues. There's new problems, and those need new solutions. And oftentimes those solutions come through entrepreneurial activity. So that's my argument for that. And in terms of culture, so I've been talking for a while. Can you kind of make your point again about culture? Because I'm not sure I got it.
Okay, so you point to Juicero, a company that's raised $120 million, if I read the number right in your piece, for a technology which, as you described it, doesn't really add very much value at all, and you're wondering, why is that the idea du jour? And you're pointing to Theranos, and you're saying we got a fraudulent, somebody made up a product that doesn't even exist, and they were able to attract billions of dollars. And I'm trying to connect that to your antitrust point, the existence of these bad cases to the concentration of power. And I'm suggesting it might have as much to do with what kind of ideas get the juices flowing of people who live in, Northern California and think of themselves as a particular way and see the country through a particular lens. That's what I mean by culture.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So, okay, so one of my favorite stories of how anti-monopoly policy, this is not antitrust, this is an anti-monopoly policy, is there was a rule, the Nixon Federal Communication Commission in 1970 or 71 did what was called the financial syndication rules, where they said to the TV networks, for primetime shows, you are not allowed to produce and own your own shows. You have to syndicate them. You have to buy from someone else. And this was because the industry had vertically integrated after several years. And so what happened is independent studios and Hollywood studios started producing TV, and creative artists got a lot more power because they could sell into a market. There was no market before that. The suits at NBC did what they wanted. But now if you had a show idea, and there were only 3 networks, right? So it's not like you had a great market, but you had a market, right?
Yeah.
And in the 1970s, because of that, some of the 70s and 80s and 90s, some of the best shows in terms of cultural diversity were produced. It's shows like All in the Family, Sanford and Sons, Seinfeld, The Cosby Show, Moonlighting, and so on. And so, what's it called? As a bunch of them. There's a list.
Yeah.
But the original Cosby Show, not that he's a great figure now, but originally the network wanted him to do a lounge act. He was very famous. They were like, we want a show about a guy who does a lounge act. And he had the power, because he had the ability to sell into a market. He had the power to say, no, I want to play a doctor, right? And it was I think, an important cultural moment for America to have a black kind of upper middle class family just doing what they do, right? And that was a result of breaking the good old boys network through market structure. And I think that that's kind of where we are with Silicon Valley, where what you have is a small group of people that control what gets produced, what gets innovated, and who gets funding, right? Because now, if you want to have an exit strategy, you can't go public. I mean, there's essentially very few IPOs. You're going to sell to like 5 companies, maybe Oracle. You throw a few others in there. And what that means is that those companies have enormous power over what gets financed, because the venture capitalists know that if they finance something that those companies don't want financed, it could hurt them. It could hurt their other portfolio companies. There is a network out there of people now who have a lot of control over what gets.
Let me just stop you on this point. This is very interesting to me. If I hear you right, you're saying, I'm a venture capitalist, I'm in Silicon Valley. The way I make my money is by channeling ideas, getting them funded past a certain level and watching them become successful. But they're not going to become successful if they don't come to the successful attention of the large companies who have their own interests. Since I know that's how I make my money, I'm not going to try to float ideas which they will regard as threatening, because I anticipate that they're going to punish me by not supporting or availing themselves of the services of some future project that I might come along with, which is a perfectly viable idea, but it might not fly because they're pissed off that I didn't get the signal that I wasn't supposed to be competing with them.
That's a perfectly possible way of doing things. I mean, there's this small business that so Amazon started a lending. Sorry for talking a lot about Amazon. I've been studying it recently, so it was a lot in my mind.
That's fine.
There's a guy who I don't know, sold something through Amazon Marketplace. I forgot what it was. And he was interviewed by the Financial Times because he had started to borrow money from Amazon's new lending business. Now that because Amazon sees all of these they see into these businesses through their marketplace, they can see which ones are good credit risks and which ones aren't. And so he's now they started a lending business. So he's borrowing from them. And what he said was really instructive, which is, I had other lenders I was borrowing from, but I started borrowing some from Amazon because when they open their good books, they'll know I'm there. Right? Now, that doesn't sound like business to me. That sounds like a weird sort of political statement of just kind of fear.
So go ahead.
I don't know. I can't speak to whether there's a cartel of venture capitalists or how they finance companies, or I don't know. I'm just saying that this is how sort of formal or informal cartel-like behavior emerges when you have a small bottleneck and you can't innovate around them and compete with them. No, like really iconoclastic weirdo with a good idea can go up and say, I am going to, fight and beat that guy, because they basically will be driven out of business through the anti-competitive tactics that are now de facto legalized, even though, as you point out, they are still technically against the law.
So tell me if this analogy that's occurring to me now is right or wrong in your view. And the analogy is that the key today is the control over information. And if I'm one of these big internet presences and I've got billions of people who are trafficking through, and I'm able to see what they do, this is valuable information. In the old days, if I were an IBM producing hardware, but producing it in such a way that somebody on the outside couldn't develop peripheral devices or whatever to work with my machines because I wasn't sharing the technology, or I was writing operating systems which I could either leave open or close to the successful adoption of somebody else's software, you could get at me by telling me I have to have my system open, or I have to, share whatever the proprietary information is that would allow people to come in. Are you suggesting that what needs to be done here is to force a Google or an Amazon to share the proprietary information that they have on their billions of people who traffic through their sites, so that outsiders could avail themselves of that information and develop new products?
Well, okay, so one way to understand the situation we're in is to look at maybe not operating systems in the 80s, because at that point antitrust was changing in some very significant ways. I would look at railroads. because railroads are a network type of industry with network monopoly characteristics.
Yeah.
And what they were doing, what you saw in the 19th century is you saw all sorts of ancillary businesses like steel and oil emerge at the same time as railroads, in some ways because of railroads. And you saw railroads using their pricing power to pick winners and losers and organize these new industries, in some cases vertically integrating into them, in some cases not. And that had enormous political consequences. It drove huge numbers of farmers into poverty. There were incredibly violent strikes, and it was also just a threat to the political liberty of Americans. At the same time as it created this remarkable technology that made life just totally different and really knitted the country together into one country with one economy. The way that we handled railroads in 1887 with the Interstate Commerce Commission and then in 1890 with the Sherman Act was to essentially say this is great technology, but we are going to regulate it to preserve and protect our democracy. What was it called? I think the Supreme Court talked about how the Sherman Act was passed to protect the interests of worthy men. Right?
I don't think we talk like that anymore.
No, we don't. But there's a lot to be said.
You're suggesting, are you? I was trained at MIT, not at the University of Chicago, but I've got enough of a neoliberal economics training in me to recoil in horror at the prospect that we want to reinvent the Interstate Commerce Commission in the 21st century to stand guardian over Silicon Valley.
So the way that we handled railroads, just to kind of, what we said is we made basically a couple of basic principles. One is, if you're a railroad with a network monopoly, no vertical integration. You can't leverage your control of one industry to go into another. And we carried that forward into AT&T type of institutions. We said, if you want to be a telephone monopoly, it's got network characteristics. You can't go into other businesses. You can't use your control of the phone network to go into other businesses. That's what we established with railroads. And then we carried that forward. I think we might have carried it forward into airlines as well, which are sort of network business. And then the split in the late 90s, the court almost split Microsoft from operating system and business productivity software, which is sort of a similar principle in some ways. So that's the first thing, is no vertical integration. And the second is posted prices, right? So no predatory pricing, no price discrimination. You can do, like when you go to the movie theater, seniors get one, seniors and veterans and children get one price.
I got it.
Yeah, but no picking winners and losers, no secret rebates, kickbacks, and so on and so forth. And those are I think that there's one more, but I think that's the gist of it. Is we said, and this moved forward into public utilities regulation, where we said is if you are a public utility with, like say you handle electricity or gas or water, where it doesn't make sense to have a duplicate to create competition because it's just super inefficient to have two power lines going into every home. We are going to make the same. It's the same problem. No vertical integration and posted prices. So you could do that with the platforms. If you think that there's multiple ways to handle this. But the basic idea is, if these platforms are operating like railroads, then you start enforcing predatory price rules again. You have posted pricing to prevent price discrimination, and you put some forms of restrictions on vertical integration. That's one possible model. Another model is to not treat them as platform monopolies, and then you could think about doing structural reforms, separating. One thing you could do is, for example, separate out Google's Gmail product from its advertising product from its mapping product, which right now they're all leveraging each other, or Amazon's use of its marketplace and its use of its data and its use of its cloud software.
Well, let me just
There are
observe.
reasons.
Excuse me interrupting. I mean, yeah, that might be helpful vis-a-vis anti-competitive behavior, but it might also undercut internal synergies within the firm that allow for these activities to complement each other and make for greater effectiveness and productivity within the firm. I mean, you can't separate them without doing something to the overall technology of production in the firm.
Yeah, I mean, you could
They're
argue.
not naturally separable, is what I'm saying.
Well, we don't know about that. I mean, the point of an antitrust trial is to
All
go
right.
in and actually discover what the anti-competitive behavior is, if there is anti-competitive behavior, and then make those changes. So, for example, one could easily see separating. There's a lot of ways to deal with. Let's just take the Kindle, right, which is Amazon's control over electronic books. There are lots of ways of handling that. You could say you got to spin that off from your. You're not allowed to sell the Kindle and also be a book publisher. Those are clearly. There is a clear conflict of interest there. You are not allowed to, but you could also say a consent decree saying you need to have an open format for ebooks and allow anyone to sell into your ebook. There's lots of ways of actually handling it. I wouldn't prescribe any particular one. I would just say it's time to start having hearings, congressional hearings, state legislative hearings. It's time to start enforcing obvious things like we know they engage in predatory pricing. It's time to bring a case on that. Yeah. And this is a process because these are multi-trillion-dollar institutions, and you don't screw with them lightly. You have to figure out how to make sure you don't do damage. Maybe it doesn't make sense to separate certain parts of their business, but you have to go in and actually figure out what's going on there.
No, that's my concern, but I take the point that it's a factual question subject to being investigated, and you will never know the answer if you don't look into it. Okay, so how's the politics of this play? Democrat, Republican, in terms of would you have imagined getting anywhere in an antitrust division of the Justice Department with this kind of argument if Hillary Clinton had won the election? I assume that not George W., but Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions' Justice Department would not be as open to these kind of arguments, but I'm just asking.
I don't know. I mean, look, I don't know what Clinton would have done. I know what Obama did, and I know what Bush did, and it was the same thing, which is nothing. There hasn't been a Section 2 monopolization case in 15 years. So, what the politics of what Trump is going to do. I mean, I know Trump doesn't like Silicon Valley, but I think Trump's administration is pretty undisciplined and does not have a lot of policy coherence. So it's hard for me to see where they're going to go with this. I just don't know. You could see action at the state level. The Microsoft suit started actually from a collection of state attorneys general who then forced it onto the FTC agenda. You also see Europeans engaged. So you see Margaret Vestager, European Competition Commissioner. She's doing a lot on Google right now. And then you also see the corporate world. Oracle is very unhappy with Google. And I'll tell you, Amazon's purchase of Whole Foods has really woken up a bunch of other companies in that space to see that they really have an existential threat. Yeah. So, you're not, it's not clear how the politics break out, but I will say this, and what makes antitrust really fun from a political perspective, and I'm a Democrat. I used to do elections before I kind of thought they were sort of foolish, not having them, but don't have control over. People pretend this is the right strategy, but whatever, people vote one way or the other, and there's just not that much you can do about it.
Right.
But it splits. Anti-monopoly actually splits both parties. So there are a lot of Democrats that are huge fans of Amazon, and there are a lot of Democrats that are very leery of Amazon, and there are also the same thing on the Republican side. So I read the Breitbart commenters, and I read commenters on liberal sites, and you really, it's pretty hard if you were just to sort of remove any of the kind of social kind of commentary, it's actually incredibly difficult to figure out what political party people are actually coming from, because it doesn't like people like 60-70% of Americans are afraid of monopoly, but it doesn't necessarily break down liberal Democrat, conservative Republican on this. A lot of conservative Republicans are like, capitalism doesn't work without competition. And a lot of Democrats, liberal Democrats, are like, hey, Amazon Prime is like socialism. It's weird. It gets weird and fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. Listen, why don't we call it a conversation at this point? I've learned a lot talking with you, unless you got something else you want to say that hasn't been said quite yet.
Well, I want to hear about your experience with the IBM case in the 70s.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was in graduate school at MIT in the mid-1970s, and a man called Franklin Fisher was a professor in the economics department, and he happened to be also the principal of an economics consulting firm that did forensic economics, going into antitrust cases and providing expert testimony on some of these factual questions about market power and competition and so on. And he hired me on as a graduate student to work as a worker bee in this massive enterprise. I completed my studies and went on to become an assistant professor of economics at Northwestern University, but I stayed with the case. The case was IBM defending itself against antitrust litigation, and David Boies, super lawyer David Boies, at that time was a partner in Cravath, Swaine, and Moore, and he was the lead litigator in the IBM defense team. I actually had some interaction, not so much with him, although I was in some meetings, but with some of the underlings on the legal team. And this was the late 1970s, and we thought of ourselves, as liberal Democrats, most of us at MIT. On the other hand, there was a huge windfall to be enjoyed in terms of consulting fees for economic expertise feeding into this case. And Frank Fisher had a boat, I think he called it Section 2. I think that was the name of his boat, after the relevant title of of the legislation that led to this lawsuit, which was enriching him and the rest of us. No. In those years, I would say that, we weren't like hardcore ideologues on the antitrust question, but there were these ideas, about stodgy regulators who are always behind the curve in terms of technological innovation, right. About the fact that you could look at market share today and you could see a firm has got 72 or 86% of the market or whatever, but tomorrow could be a completely different thing. Mainframe computers might end up being significantly outcompeted by desktop technology that doesn't exist when this series of lawsuits get started. And a sense that regulation is necessary because there is market failure, but there's also political failure. Regulatory agencies get captured by interested parties, and you end up with a lot of economic inefficiency, often under regulatory regimes that are driven by, sort of stodgy and outdated ideas about what constitutes, as it were, true competition. And also a lot of concern about, structural reforms, breaking up, separating off, and a worry of, killing the goose that's laying the golden egg, about throwing your baby out with the bathwater, something like that. Overreach in terms of structural adjustments undertaken by lawyers who don't really understand the technology and who have political as well as, straightforwardly economic motivation. So that's my recollection of that time. It was early in my career. I didn't stick with it. I moved on to doing other things, but I was present in the late 1970s during a lot of this stuff.
That's really interesting. It sounds exactly consistent with the reading I've done about it. So yeah. Was it George Stigler and regulatory capture and all that?
Yep, and Landis and Posner and Bork. A lot of people in Chicago were writing about this kind of stuff. Miss Cannon. It seems like a lifetime ago.
Well, I found that really interesting, so thank you. And I enjoyed the conversation.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it too. Maybe we'll find something else to talk about at some point.
Sounds awesome. Thanks, man. Talk to you later.
Yeah, talk to you later. Bye bye now. So I'm gonna